Also er war permanent anwesend.
He was permanently present. And at some point, not only for me, the circle expanded at some point onto my husband. For example, what always happened in the evening was that the lights dimmed and got brighter by themselves. For instance, night lights that were next to the bed, they had knobs that you could manually move up and down. That happened on its own. So it was almost a bit spooky, but not for us.
Miss Dogan, you're a grief counselor for parents who suffered child loss. You're also a manager and help contacting the dead as a medium. Your strongly spiritual-oriented life began in April 2017, when your son died at the age of barely 2 years. I would like to ask you to start, please tell us what happened back then.
Ja, also im April 2017.
Yes. So in April 2017, on Easter Sunday, we had a call in the morning. The children, my son and our daughter, 4 years old at the time, were both visiting their grandparents. And then there was a call. Devin has choked and is now being resuscitated. That was the information I remember most clearly. In the years that followed, I often asked myself, what was the course of events on that day? Sometimes it's a bit blurred, but I remember exactly this sentence. He choked on a carrot and is now being resuscitated. And then, of course, we immediately rushed to the grandparents. It was a 15-minute drive. And when we got there, Devin was being resuscitated. There were many paramedics there, and also a pastor. And when I saw the pastor, I knew it wouldn't end well. It was as if at that moment it was clear that what I might have suspected before had occurred. Well, at some point the doctors stopped resuscitating him and decided to take him to the university clinic in Frankfurt.
But he was alive.
No, he wasn't. But at that moment, we weren't informed about his condition. We weren't allowed to go to him either. He was separated. And nobody told us he's no longer alive or his heart is no longer beating. It was like, let's get to work now, but we don't know how it will turn out. And at some point, they told us they're taking him to the university clinic under these conditions. And we were brought there by another ambulance. In the university clinic, they continued with the resuscitation. I don't have a sense of time, but I think the whole resuscitation phase was about 2 hours, or 2.5 hours. And during that time, we waited outside. At some point, the doctor, the intensive care physician, came out of the shock room. It all happened in this intensive care unit. And then it was like in a movie, when the doctor comes out of the room and doesn't say anything. He even shrugged his arms and shook his head. That was the image that stayed with me. And he didn't say a word. And then we knew he didn't make it. And then we got the opportunity to say goodbye to our son. There was another woman pastor with us. I remember I was totally in a trance. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I was pregnant at the time with our third child. End of pregnancy. I was in my 33rd week. It was just before the end of the pregnancy. And a lot of it was like I was in a trance. I don't know. When I think back on it, sometimes I feel like some of it has been erased.
How did you feel about the whole experience? Were you able to process it? How did your husband feel?
No, not at all. On the first day, I felt like I was standing behind glass. I didn't realize what had happened. A few hours later, I truly realized what had happened. And then it was total despair. Incredible despair. You can't even describe it in words. Today I'd say it's like dying yourself. That's how it must be. When you live and die, that's what I thought at the time. That's how it must feel. And I was absolutely shocked. I couldn't act. I had no real sense of time. I think the day after that, it started to sink in. And then I was in a state of total exception for several days. But what was amazing was that after 1 or 2 days, I started to perceive him.
In what forms did you perceive him?
The first thing I perceived was a smell.
A typical smell.
Yes, his smell. The way his body and he smelled. That was the first thing I perceived. And at the time I thought, oh, now I'm hallucinating.
It was that intense?
Yes, exactly. It was unbelievable. Is that really his smell? But it didn't stop. The next thing I perceived were body touches, as if he were lying here on my arm. I really felt this physical proximity to my body. And then, in the following days, there were other things. Suddenly, I had the feeling that someone was pulling on my hair, like constant touches. But I was so totally beside myself, so I wasn't quite sure what was going on.
It lasted days?
Yes, it lasted days.
And only during certain occasions?
No, all the time. All the time. After the funeral, I had the feeling that it was going to become less, that something was going to change. The funeral was a moment or a time when I had the impression that it felt a bit different. Well, I've always been a spiritual person. I've always dealt with the subject of life and death. What is it? What concept is believable to me? And I had memorized from somewhere that the soul needs 3 days before it leaves this earthly realm. And then it was Easter Sunday. And after 5 days, he was buried. And then I thought, no, that's this period of time. I just perceived him very intensely for 3 days. That must have been the reason. And that was kind of an anchor, this whole process. On the one hand, my concept, my inner belief concept.
You knew he was going to live on?
Yes. I never doubted that. It was always clear to me that he was going to live on in some way. The only thing I didn't know at the time, and the difference to today, is that I only believed at the time, and I had no proof. And today I would say I know it. That's the difference between faith and knowledge. And when the burial was over, this whole mourning process began. And then I remembered. There is a little flashback to this whole story. In January 2017, 3 or 4 months before he died, I had visions. And that was information. It was something like I looked at him in an everyday situation and suddenly I had the information he was going to die soon. Just like that. It was like a premonition.
You briefly mentioned that you had suspected it. Was that because of this vision?
Yes, exactly. But it wasn't the only time. The first time, as a mother, you don't want to think about it. You think, oh, these are just your fears. And then I quickly tried to put these thoughts aside. But it repeated itself. In total 3 times up to the accident. And shortly before the accident, I really had the feeling that something bad was going to happen.
On that day?
It was on Easter. And on the day when the 2 children went to their grandparents, I said to my husband, I have a very strange feeling. Something feels strange to me. Something is going to happen. And then I called my mother-in-law and said, please make sure that you clear the objects from the balcony, because Devin is always climbing now. I'm a little worried about that. I had a very concrete premonition. Today I know that it was a premonition. Back then I thought it was just a maternal fear. So I felt that it was going to happen. And when it happened, it was like a confirmation. But that wasn't good, because then it was like you felt it, but you didn't stop it. Even worse if you felt it beforehand. And that's when the search began. In combination with all the perceptions, my premonition and what I felt, I was just determined to find out where he is now. What happened to him now? Where did he go when he died? Because he didn't die. He's still there.
That was certain.
That was certain. I have to understand that now. And then I looked for a grief counselor. Actually, I didn't look for him, I looked for the topic. I started reading books very quickly about this whole topic. Of course, I had already read Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, where it's really about dying and near-death or death research. What I didn't have on my radar at the time, because it wasn't relevant to me, was communication with the dead and mediumship. It didn't matter to me. My grandparents had died by that time. Otherwise, it hadn't happened to me. So it didn't matter in my life. When my son crossed over, I really wanted to know. I wanted to understand. What is it? How does it work? That's how my grief led me to a spiritual counselor. And that's how I was led to a medium through him.
One he recommended.
Exactly. He recommended a medium to me. He said, if you want to get in touch with your son, I have this and that address. Less than 5 weeks had passed since his death, and I had already made an appointment with this medium. The appointment was supposed to take place a few months later, but then I got excited about it. In the meantime, my daughter was born. Then I was busy with very earthly things and turned on the function mode. And at some point, this appointment with the medium happened.
Until then, were there any other after-death contacts?
Yes.
Yes.
He was permanently present. And at some point, not only for me, the circle expanded at some point to my husband. For example, what always happened in the evening was that the lights dimmed and got brighter by themselves. For instance, night lights that were next to the bed, they had knobs that you could manually move up and down. That happened on its own. So it was almost a bit spooky, but not for us.
You didn't find it eerie?
We didn't find it eerie. We both knew immediately what was happening. Or what also was very impressive, we had a lamp above the dining table with a lot of pearls on it. And it always moved back and forth, although all windows were closed and all doors. And we sat there eating with the whole family, also the grandparents, and then this lamp moved in front of everyone's eyes, and everyone looked at each other and knew. It was like an unspoken knowledge. We know what's going on right now. Nobody was ever afraid. These signs, today of course you talk about signs, for me it was a presence. It was the whole time. It was the whole first year that I had a feeling our son was present.
And when you talk about the dimmer or the lamps, it's about lights.
Yes.
Did that somehow trigger a special connection for you in relation to sensing his current situation?
The visit to the medium was very interesting. In addition to all the evidence that she had, as is done in evidence-oriented mediumship, there was one statement that he was in the world to illuminate the light of others with his light. And the fact that the light always dimmed up and down was an extraordinary proof for us. The statement of the medium in combination with what he showed us was like a kind of fulfillment of what she had told us. We always perceived him as very radiant.
Very present.
Exactly, a very, very radiant child. When we walked somewhere with him, people always stopped and looked at him, because he always shone on everyone. He just had a really happy nature. A very, very friendly, cheerful, radiant child. All parents say that about their children, that they are special. I think it's good that it's like that. But what was striking about him was that other people also perceived him as radiant. And that just fits together for us, that he also showed himself through the light and dimmed the lamps up and down. In general, I would say he showed himself a lot through electrical phenomena. Cell phone showed something that was untypical in a situation, or it suddenly stopped working. Everything that had to do with electricity, we noticed that something was happening. But for me, the most important thing was that I felt him.
This first contact with a medium, how did you experience it? Was it normal for you? Was it natural? How did you experience it?
I was very excited. The medium was in another city. I had to go there. I had a little baby. It was all very time-consuming for me. She held her meeting in her apartment, a very, very friendly atmosphere with a view of the garden. She first told me what she was doing or what was happening there, how she would initiate the contact. But otherwise, she didn't ask or want to know anything else.
Not about the circumstances of the death.
No, nothing at all. She just wanted to know how my deceased was cold. Then she said she saw a child in kindergarten age and described him, and that he was so radiant and friendly and shone on her. As she described him, it was clear to me that it was him. Then she was able to describe the circumstances. You can't imagine her saying things in a very plastic way, that he choked on a carrot. It's not like that. The medium feels into what the deceased felt in that moment. She said, "I can't swallow." She felt what happened to him, and that was enough. At that moment, it wasn't about dissecting it further. That's not helpful. But it's a proof when she doesn't know what happened and she can describe what happened to him. Then she described what he showed her. He told her 2 or 3 things. He told her many things that came up later. For example, he showed her a book. She asked me if the book had any meaning for me. Then I said I read a lot, and maybe that's what he means. Then she continued and said, "No, he said you should write down what you experience with him from this side." It was almost an instruction. The next thing was, she said he shows me a desk where he often sits with his sister. And she draws in a painting book with a purple pen. It's a painting book with a princess on it. And he says the princess is called Sophia. I didn't know what to do with that. I said, maybe. I can't confirm, but I can't say it's not true either. And that was something later proved when I was at home. When I was at home, I told my husband that our son had said there is a painting book with a purple pen with a princess on it, and her name is Sophia. And he said, "I think I know there is such a book." But we didn't find it. It was well hidden in her room. When she was at home, we asked her, "Do you have a painting book with a princess?" "Yes, yes. It was a gift from my grandpa." We said, "Go and get it." And then she got it, and it was a very small book with white pages with a princess on it, a Walt Disney figure, and her name is Princess Sophia. I didn't know that at the time, because Walt Disney wasn't a topic yet. And in the book, there was only one page with a purple pen. And that was so unbelievable for me. So many details were put together that are impossible for someone to make up, I would say. It was out of the question, and that was enough for my mind.
That was what you were looking for?
Yes, that's what I wanted. I wanted to be proven, and I couldn't have gotten anything more explicit.
And later you also trained as a medium yourself.
Exactly. In the beginning of 2019, when my grief was very intense, I had the feeling that my perceptions of my son were getting weaker, that I didn't feel him as strongly as in the beginning. And then I thought that this can't happen now. So I'll look for some training where I can learn how to make it stronger, or where I can learn how it works as a method. So in the beginning of 2019, I went to a mediumship training with Nina Herzberg. She lived in my area, and the training was just around the corner. I never told anyone about it because it was just for me. And it took a few years because I gave myself a lot of time. I became a mother again in 2019. And 2 years ago, I started to give mediumship meetings to training clients, just to make it even stronger in practice. And that's how I started to give mediumship sessions. It has grown over time.
But there was already a disposition present that you were then able to develop.
Yes, that's right. I always felt a lot with people, and I wasn't aware that there was more, or that this opening to the spiritual world would be possible for me. I wasn't aware of it until my son died. It was so present that I couldn't ignore it. But before that, it didn't matter in my life. I always believed that there was something like that, but I never saw myself as someone who could do something like that. Others can do it, but I can't. I have a normal earthly life, very worldly. I have a job, I have children, I do very down-to-earth things, and that didn't matter in my life. But when he died, and I experienced it so presently, I just couldn't ignore it. It wasn't doable for me.
Did you find more intense contact with him?
Yes. Through this training, I was able to have a real dialogue with him. Because what happened during the training, one thing was that I suddenly felt that it works with other deceased people too. It doesn't just work with my son. It always works. It's repeatable. It was an aha effect. They're all here. I'm no exception. I think it's very important for deceased people, and especially for parents, to realize that it's not wishful thinking that their child is still there. That's what tormented me the most. What if I'm just imagining it all? Then it doesn't help me at all. Then it's just a construct with which I might survive. But it's not reality. And I really want to know. I want to know if it's real. And I was able to prove that during the training. Because if I repeat 50 or 60 sessions, which I had after a while, then it's always possible. And every deceased person is somehow different. They're not stereotypes. There were specific things which I didn't imagine. I would never do that. I know how painful it is when your own child dies or someone dies who's close to you. I would never want to lie to myself. And that was a bigger proof to realize that all deceased people are there. And every one of them says something different. Every one of them died differently. So what I perceive is real. And meanwhile, I gave hundreds of sessions, and it always works with almost every one of them. Of course, there are deceased people who are not as communicative, or there's no good contact. That rarely happens. But in most cases, this contact works. And if it's repeatable, then it's real. And then it was clear to me that it was never just my imagination. It's real. The deceased are always there. The only thing that changes is the state of aggregation, which changes when we leave our bodies. And that's extremely comforting. It's extremely comforting to know that this doesn't end here but that we will meet again in another form.
At that point, you no longer sought evidence. Nevertheless, during these hundreds of sessions, were there also events that provided evidence for you? Things that you could see and perceive in such a highly specific way, which could then be confirmed? Or was it even the norm that there were such specific things?
There are sessions in which highly specific content comes from the deceased. They are so special that the relatives say that's incredible. For example, often it is names. When names are mentioned, and it happens very often, at least with me, that names come up, that really convinces clients. Or if I may give an example, a father shows how he works in his workshop. He has a shelf with a radio on it. And he says, while I was working there, I always listened to the radio. This shelf with the radio was very special. And he also mentions the radio station. And it's not even a popular station, but something very special that not everyone listens to. Then, of course, it is an amazing form of proof for the relatives. How should the medium know that he had a workshop? The workshop, this shelf with the radio, and he listened to a certain station? That's one example. Or I had one deceased. It seemed so mundane to me. That's a thing you have to get out of your head, that what they are saying is mundane. But I thought he said, tell her, I always ate schnitzel. And I thought, I can't say that he always ate schnitzel. But then I learned at some point, okay, I'll just say it. And then she said, that can't be. He really always ate schnitzel. And these are things that are very comforting for relatives. Because these are details that are so specific that you can say, no, these are not stereotypical statements. And that's one of many examples. What is also often asked is, what was put in the coffin? For example, and I had a meeting once where the child showed me several things. So there was a piece of clothing there, a picture, and he also showed me something in his hands. And for me, it looked like a chain or like a piece of jewelry. And at first I thought, was that a rose wreath? I couldn't see it exactly, but I could see that it was a chain, kind of chain. And the mother then said that was the chain of his pacifier. And that was extremely comforting. And with the same contact, there was another special feature. The child showed me a book. And on the book was a sun, moon, stars, and a little blonde boy depicted. And of course, I immediately thought, yes, that was the little prince. And the mother read it to him. And she said, no, that's not true. I never read it to him. There was a reason why she never read it to him, but that doesn't matter at all. She denied everything in the meeting, and I was a little disappointed. And a few days later, she contacted me and said she was at home again. And at home, there is a small altar for the sun. And there she saw it. She showed me a book with sun, moon, stars, and a blonde boy. It was a children's song prayer book, which the grandmother had put on his altar. But the mother didn't know that. That's why she denied it in the session. And these are very, very specific things, which later, after the contact, when they first prove themselves after the contact, are very, very impressive.
When you hear names or see things like this book, what is this hearing and seeing compared to a sensory, physical perception?
It takes place internally. It's an inner hearing, an inner seeing. These are pictures that take place in front of the inner eye. Names are more like information or sounds that you hear. I once had a meeting with a brother, and I always heard a clatter. It's in the inner ear. It's hard to describe. It's not an external perception.
But it is clear.
Yes, it's clear. In this case, it sounded like a horse galloping. It was like... And then I copied it, and I said, I always hear this. Did he ride? It's a clatter. And then he said, no, but I know what it is. Ask again in more detail. And then I saw a racket. I thought it was a tennis racket. And then I said, he played tennis. And then he said, no, but table tennis. And that sounded to me like horse sounds. I don't know what you call it, galloping. Well, you know what I mean. I couldn't recognize it, but I heard it. With names, it's more like information. Suddenly, the name is there. Sometimes very special names. I don't even know. Or Clara, or Lily. Not necessarily that a grandma is there and there's a grandma's name. It's very specific. And sometimes it sounds like something to me, but the name was just similar. You can't always hear it 100% right.
I have a question about the afterlife. Near-death experiences often speak of an indescribable expansion of their self, that they were shrouded in unconditional love, that they felt connected to everything. They speak of an experience of unity, which seems to greatly change their individual personality. When you compare near-death experiences to mediumistic messages, you notice that in mediumistic messages people are basically portrayed as you know them. They show themselves. They are somehow perceptible as the person they were on Earth. Can you compare these images? Did you specifically ask that what you experience, what your son shows you, or what other deceased people show you, happens in the sense of a translation, so that they can be perceived? That would mean that nothing is said about how they really experience the other world.
Yes, that's an interesting question. Often during these contacts with the afterlife, people ask, what is my deceased relative doing in the other world? And my honest answer is, I don't know. Because it doesn't matter for us to know what they are doing. This information is not relevant. A translation is exactly the expression I would use, too. In my view, or in the way I see the communication with the afterlife, is that we communicate with energy. And energy is information. It's about the fact that this information, the energy of the deceased, exists. And that's why we can retrieve this information. And so that we can integrate this into our consciousness of reality, they show themselves in the way we have stored them as an image and as an understanding of who they are. If they would show themselves in a completely different image, for example, in the form of I'm part of an entity, or I'm just a fragment, I mean, there are so many theories about this topic of what is really incarnating, then we wouldn't necessarily understand this from our human point of view, in our 3D images and with our brain capacities. And the information or the energy has the intention to comfort us. So a kind of translation takes place in 3D consciousness. That's my explanation for it. For instance, the question, is he always with me? Yes, of course. but the energy is with me, not the person. It's not that plastic. I think there's still a part that I probably don't know and that I can't explain, and at some point I decided that it has no relevance. It has no relevance for me and my human existence. What is relevant for me is that energy doesn't die. It's immortal, and it reunites. That is relevant. Existence is not extinguished with the death of my physical body, and that alone has to be enough for me. And at some point, I decided that it's enough for me because if I can communicate with any kind of energy, then that means that existence and life are inextinguishable. And yes, I've asked myself, why near-death experiences sketch completely different pictures. Sometimes there are pictures of cities and dimensions. From my very grounded point of view, it's all too out there for me. So at some point I thought that it's not my job to analyze this.
Whatever awaits us in the world beyond can remain a secret. In mediumship, it's first and foremost about comfort, about the message, I am here. But it's not about a large, comprehensive worldview.
Yes. And it's about company. I think it's mainly about people not having to feel separated. I think that's the main aspect why the deceased show themselves. That they show their relatives that they're still accompanied, that they're still in contact. The main need is to share that they're still there and that they can still have a relationship. Her relationship doesn't end with death. I think that's even more important than the knowledge that there's a life after death. Most of what we suffer from is the end of the relationship. But what we learn, as I've cultivated it with my son over the years, is that we have a different kind of relationship.
How did the contact with your son continue?
With my son, it became like an inner dialogue. At some point, I felt better over the years, and then he wasn't permanently by my side anymore. But when I needed him and called him, I could immediately establish a connection. Then it was like a dialogue. I don't see him as my little son anymore. In the beginning, yes. In the meantime, I see him as a bit ageless. His communication is at eye level. It's a communication of the soul. It's no longer a mother-child relationship. What we have now is bigger than just me having been his mother when he was here.
And you see it as your task to ensure that this process of transformation and realization, which has accompanied you intensively since the event, also has a somewhat socially transformative effect.
Definitely. Today I would call myself a happier person than I used to be. It made me a happier person because I know how quickly life can come to an end and that it's finite. It's not just at some point, but at any time. It's our job as humans to change the perspective on life and death. We have to do the best we can out of the time we spend on Earth. Most of the time, it's the fears that stop us from changing. I don't have them anymore. I wouldn't know what to fear because the worst day of my life is already over. I think the best thing is to live for what we came for. The joy, the zest, and curiosity for experiences are always a good indicator. I think that's why we're all here. We have to live for it. We have to bring together the experiences of Earth and the experiences of the other world. We're not just one or the other. We're part of both. It's our job to be human. The most spiritual thing we can do is to be human. And life and death are both part of it. Sorrow and joy can coexist.
I think that was the perfect closing word. Thank you for the interview.
Dankeschön.